Please remember, the views expressed on Albertans in Space by our guests and hosts alike are opinions and do not represent the entire industry as a whole. Our podcast serves only as a platform, and all topics discussed are primarily for educational purposes only. Welcome to Albertans in Space, the series where we talk to Albertans making waves in the local and global space industry. In today's episode, Myths That Shape Us, we talk to Dr. Jim Ellis and Dr. Noreen Humble about their book, Mythologies of Outer Space. We'll chat about how all cultures connect the land and sky through storytelling, and how these stories provide lessons and how we can shape the future of space exploration. I'm your host, Zac Trolley.
And I'm your co-host and Aurora Borealis chaser, Meghan Westelmajor. Hey, Zac, did you hear about the new book about anti-gravity?
No, is it any good?
It's impossible to put down.
Oh, jokes. Albertans in Space is filmed in the city of Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. This land, traditionally called Mohkinstsis, belongs to many nations and people who make their home here. We honor the traditions taught to us by our elders to acknowledge the generosity of Mother Earth and to take care of our land as humanity expands to new worlds. Now, Meghan, do you have a favorite story, myth, or legend?
Oh my God, just one? Yeah, I love the story of Le Petit Prince, aka the Little Prince, who travels the universe gaining wisdom. The Little Prince visits planets, including Earth, and touches on themes of loneliness, friendship, love, and loss, which I think are key elements to growth as a kid. It's a bit somber, but it includes a lot of fantastical and unreal elements that really appeal to the imagination of kids. Do you have a favorite?
You know, the original storytellers are in some way the Greeks. You know, they have myths of Hercules, Icarus, Medusa, Pandora's box. You know, these have been told over and over and over the centuries. But one of my favorites is the story of Atlas. He was a titan condemned to carry the world on his shoulders, separating us mortals from the heavens. It's similar to the North American myth of Turtle Island, where the world is kept afloat on the back of a giant turtle.
Amazing. I would love to live on a giant turtle.
Float around, yeah.
I've always wondered, does myth always mean fiction?
Not really. I mean, myths are traditional stories, often with supernatural elements that help explain a culture's beginning, beliefs, or understanding of nature. They're not strictly factual, but they're super important culturally, often used to teach lessons and reinforce values. While myth sometimes get a bad rap for meaning untrue, in academic and cultural circles, myths are highly valued for their symbolic meaning and how they shape a society's view of the world.
For many, these stories come in the form of bedtime stories. I remember going to bed with such vivid dreams after hearing a story that my mom or dad would tell me. Oral storytelling is where it all began. Even within many Indigenous cultures, the community depends on the oral telling of stories, teachings, and knowledge to preserve their history and uphold their cultural identity and pass these lessons on to their children.
You know, reading to your kids allows them a more visual sense of the story, and just instead of just focusing on reading the material, humans are very visual. I remember more TV shows and video games and textbooks I've ever read.
Not gonna lie, I've forgotten what I did yesterday.
What did you do yesterday?
I was here.
You were here.
One of my favorite myths is the stories of the man on the moon. All countries have their own version of what they believe the man on the moon story is, but it is centered around a man being banished to the moon as punishment for stealing or working on the Sabbath. God forbid, literally.
Now, the moon can be seen by anyone, anywhere. It's a great connector. But before we knew what the moon looked like, we gave it life through myths. And now that we know there's no life on the moon, one of the questions is it dead? And that's the theme of the first chapter of Mythologies of Outer Space, titled How We Let the Moon Die and Why It Isn't Dead. In this chapter, Alice Gorman mentions that how we define the term life may be at least partially a result of prioritizing human senses, such as vision, evolved from terrestrial circumstances, and maybe our eyes don't suit the moon. You know, in short, maybe we only know what Earth life is, and maybe we don't have the senses to understand alien worlds like the moon.
I never thought about that before. Our senses really guide us in making sense of the world.
They do, but in space, no one can hear you scream. Sorry, that's from my favorite movie. So we did touch on the power of art and science fiction, talking with Brian Versteegen in our last season. And today we're going to dig a little deeper into fictional stories, poems, and essays, and speak with the researchers who create a collection of these to help us shape our ethical, moral, and social perspectives all about space.
Well, no better way to finish our season 2 chapter than with our final guests. Yes, you heard that right. Guests, plural. On today's episode, Dr. Jim Ellis and Dr. Noreen Humble will be joining us in studio. Jim Ellis is a professor of English at the University of Calgary and director of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. Did you know that it was Canada's oldest humanities institute? He teaches 16th century poetry and prose, about which he has written numerous essays and books, including most recently, The Poem, the Garden, and the World, Poetry and Performity in Elizabethan England. As director of the CIH, he has edited a series of books on the environmental humanities: Calgary, City of Animals, Water Rights, Reimagining Water in the West, and Intertwined Histories, Plants in Their Social Context. Noreen Humble is a professor of classics and associate director at the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. She has written widely on the ancient Greek authors Xenophon and Plutarch, as well as their own reception to the classical world to the present day. She is the author of the award-winning Xenophon of Athens, A Socratic on Sparta. She is currently engaged in a number of international collaborative projects looking at the transmission of ancient histories throughout the lenses of book history and translation studies.
Let's use the magic of video editing to invite our guests on the set. So if you're ready to invite our guests, let's get them on the set right now. Welcome to Albertans in Space. Thank you for joining us here on this beautiful afternoon. Jim, I want to start with you. If you can just tell us about your book.
Sure. Well, the book has its origins in the 42nd annual community seminar of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. So every year, the Calgary Institute for the Humanities identifies a topic that we think is going to be of interest to Calgarians, Albertans, and we invite 3 experts from 3 different fields to come and talk to us about it. So that particular year, the topic we chose was Who Owns Outer Space? So we invited Alice Gorman, an Australian space archaeologist, Chris Pack, a Welsh science fiction expert, and Hilding Nelson, who is a Mi'kmaq astronomer who teaches at Memorial University. So in addition to those 3 and their perspectives, we invited a poet, local, Kyle Flemmer, who has a beautiful series of poems on the life cycle of stars. And we also showed a short experimental film by an American filmmaker. And the name of the film all of a sudden escapes me. Afronauts. Okay. Yes, about the Zambian Space Academy, which was a really interesting moment in the space race that happened in 1964, which we could talk about. So we had the seminar. A lot of people came. It was a lively day. It was a great series of interactions, and we decided to make a book out of it.
Okay.
So we asked our 4 people if they would contribute basically a version of their talk. And then we looked around, kind of like you people do, for other people in Alberta who might have a perspective on some of these issues. So we particularly looked for artists, of which there are many in the province, who are dealing with one kind of space issue or other. We wanted something on the Rothney Astrophysical Observatory, which is approaching its 50th anniversary this year and is a really great part of Alberta space culture. We looked for people inside the university that had particular interests. So the University of Calgary has an amazing science fiction collection, 30,000 books and other documents by a local collector. It's an astonishing and crazy collection of stuff. So we got one of the scholars associated with the cataloging of that to write about that. We got somebody from engineering who is actually an artist who works with NASA on biomimicry. So there's all kinds of different people at the university. And as well, of course, to flesh it out a bit, my colleague Noreen talked about the history of fictional space exploration from the classical era onwards. And another little bit of Calgary, we have the world expert on the classical writer Lucian. And Lucian, we think, wrote the first account in the Western world of a trip to the moon. And this person, Keith Sidwell, agreed to retranslate it for us. So that's a part of the book as well. So it's a really broad, interesting collection with a real Alberta focus.
Now, Noreen, the both of you worked on this book. So what was it like diving into space topics and learning about them while co-authoring a book? What was that process like?
Well, it was fantastic, really, because neither of us are space experts. This was an opportunity for us to learn all sorts of different things. You know, we're used to asking broad questions from our humanities background about various topics, political, social, etc. But to focus in on this was quite extraordinary. And I just learned all sorts of things that I had no idea about. And I think, as you said before, Megan, while we were talking before, everyone has an interest in space. And it was just such a privilege to learn about all the amazing different perspectives that people were bringing to thinking about it. You know, not just the scientific side, but the humanities side as well.
Now, when we talk to people in space and space exploration, they often say, we don't know the answer yet when we're looking at things. And, when we do myths and stories and poetry, it's trying to figure those things out, not scientifically, but almost spiritually. So how was that journey? Like you said, you didn't know anything about that you're figuring out, because we often run into unknowns. What was that like for you, learning new things on this frontier?
Yeah, I think I knew Lucian's work before, but I hadn't thought about it in this way. And the space journey is part of a bigger satire of travel writing, of philosophy, of all sorts of things, very complex work. But it was really interesting to me to look at it and where it had an influence. I got to read all these amazing works through time that drew on Lucian, but also went a lot further. But to see the extraordinary imagination of people who could only look up into the sky with their naked eye for a lot of this time until Galileo, and we got a telescope coming then, but to see what they made of it, and particularly aspects when they thought about, if we're on the moon, for example, or the sun or the morning star Venus, what would Earth look like? I mean, that was just extraordinarily interesting to see how they negotiated that. So, I mean, the human imagination is amazing. And I think that was just seeing the different ways of looking at space and imagining what it would be like to be out there was just amazing.
And that looking back, I think, is so important. It was during the Apollo 8 mission where they were supposed to be recording the moon. And if you listen to the flight recorder, they actually stopped their mission mid-flight. And I think there are some swear words, so I won't put them here. But it was point the camera at Earth. It was not in the script. It wasn't supposed to be doing. And that's where we got that Earthrise image that you can find in posters. The iconic, yeah. And it's everywhere. It wasn't scripted, but they were literally struck in awe about what they were seeing, the first human beings to ever have that viewpoint.
Yeah.
I think, what was it? It was a Carl Sagan in wasn't Cosmos, but which one was it, when he says, they should have sent a poet in going in space exploration, and how do we tell these stories?
Yeah.
From that point of view.
There's a really interesting novel, actually, that just won the Booker Prize last year, Samantha Harvey's Orbital. I don't know if you've read it.
No.
It's from the perspective of people on the space station, and it takes you through 24 hours, which is 18 revolutions of the Earth, and it just talks about what they're seeing and what they're feeling as they look at Earth, and how they're thinking about Earth changes because of this encounter from far away. So there's a poetic. There's the poet for you, sort of looking back and reflecting. And what's great with this book is you can actually, of course, call up the view of the space station and kind of look at it as you're reading the book and thinking about how these people are encountering this particular vision.
I love that so much. And what I love too about the book is that you're critically analyzing what the space means to humankind and how we view it and how we should be thinking about it before we enter into living and working in space. And I really appreciate that critical lens. What are the main takeaways from the book that you would love people to take away?
Alice Gorman has a really interesting quote in her book that a spacecraft is not just a piece of technology. It's embedded in history and politics and emotion. And I think that this is something that we always have to think about when we're thinking about space. Science fiction is really interesting. It's the most philosophical of genres, and it has asked many of these questions.
Yeah.
Over the last 2,000 years, it's pieced out many of these scenarios and thought about many of the ethical challenges, whether it's colonialism, environmentalism.
Now we have AI and all those things that come up. What happens when this has intersections? Yeah, absolutely.
And so the humanists have actually thought about many of the things that the engineers are going to encounter or have encountered. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why, when we're thinking about, for example, the space treaty and renegotiating it, why you need to have a philosopher and a poet and a historian and an archaeologist and a sociologist at the table. They can think about all the various cultural ramifications of this. All of the people on Earth have a stake in the moon.
100%.
And therefore, I think we all should have a voice in thinking about what happens with the moon, who goes to the moon, what happens to that moon, and so on. There's never been a culture that has not thought about the moon, that has not invested the moon with meaning. We all own a part of it. And so we all have to be represented at that table. It's not just, can we mine the moon, but should we mine the moon? How should we mine the moon? What are the other implications of that? What people are going to be affected by that? Even people in the uncontacted tribes of Brazil who might have a relationship to that moon that might be affected by a dust storm that changes the face of the moon, for example.
And, you mentioned, people, and it's even our animals and our ecosystem, right? Many animals evolved to navigate by moonlight. Human eyesight is calibrated to the sunny day and a full moon. So, it has massive impacts on everything on the moon. I think you're exactly right. We should be conscious of what we're doing.
I think there's two of our essays, at least I think, talk about light pollution and why we should be thinking about that and why we should be trying to do something about it. And particularly when you mentioned animals there, it has a huge effect on a lot of animals and insects and things. If there's too much light, you've got to have this there. They've evolved to work through this light and dark kind of or moonlit environment. So I think it's very interesting too. That's a nice question that comes up a number of times when we're thinking about what we're putting into outer space and then how that is affecting, as well as what we're doing on Earth, obviously with all the big cities and the lighting. The Rothney was a dark sky sort of zone, but we had a wonderful evening out there a couple of months ago. And I was talking to a couple of the PhD students working one of the telescopes, and they were saying it is starting to be a problem now because the city is moving so far towards them, south. Absolutely. So they can look one way. It's not, it's still not too bad, but you start turning and you can see the city lights. So that's always evolving, and we're not going to stop that, but they're putting forward ideas about how you can be responsible about lighting, particularly at night and things. So hopefully some of that, is taken up.
And those have cultural ramifications as well, which one of our other authors talks about, Hilding Nelson, and his discussion of astrocolonialism. He talks about those indigenous cultures for whom star stories retail all kinds of knowledges. So he talks about the story of Muin and the 7 hunters, about the bear that's hunted by the 7 birds over the course of the year. And that story tells us things, about the movement of the circumpolar stars and paired stars and how they operate. But it also tells those indigenous folks about when you should hunt a bear, for example. You hunt it in the spring, you hunt it in the fall. All kinds of different knowledges are encoded in that. And so if light pollution impedes your ability to actually see those stars and the movements of the stars, you're cutting people off from traditional knowledge. I mean, one doesn't want to go so far as to say it's a kind of cultural genocide, but it definitely blocks access to traditional knowledge that we need to think about. As Noreen says, presumably the light pollution is there and it's harming astronomers, it's harming animals, it's harming indigenous cultures, but we do need to think better.
So you mentioned the UN Outer Space Treaty, and you just mentioned, cultural heritage. And I believe in the treaty, it says space and the celestial bodies are the culture of mankind, it says in the writing. And that's often seen as a barrier to the commercialization of space. That because it is the heritage, because it's publicly owned by everybody, it can't be owned by anybody. Some people may say that is a very positive thing. And there's, obviously others that say, it's a negative thing. With poets and storytellers being at the table, with interacting with all of them, did you get a sense of fear from them? Did you get a sense of hopefulness from them? What was the collective feeling in that effort to bring the humanities to this, very quickly evolving frontier?
Well, I think, the 79 Space Treaty is a really optimistic document coming out of a moment of fear in a way. They've come out of the Cold War. They're worried about militarization of space. And that phrase, that it being the common heritage of mankind, is a lovely sentiment, I think, that for me kind of rings a little bit with Star Trek and its early optimism.
Right.
The UN in space is kind of the federation. And I think that there is a concern there should be a concern among many people about what happens when you allow for a kind of untrammeled commercialization of space. Robert Thirsk, the astronaut, reflects on that in the afterword to the book he wrote, the afterword that he wrote for us in the book, that there need to be guardrails.
Right.
If you're going to space not to advance knowledge, not to advance the common good, but rather to advance a profit motive, I think guardrails need to be put around that. I think it's no accident, really, that if you think about a lot of popular science fiction dystopias, the villain is often a major corporation.
Right. Yeah.
And there's a good reason for that.
Absolutely.
I think that we are suspicious of people who are doing it for motives that might be a bit more selfish than the good of mankind. So I know people say that document is outdated, which it is. It doesn't really imagine Elon Musk.
The future we have today, right?
The future is now.
It's a 60-year-old document, so it needs to be updated.
It does need to be updated. But again, I think it needs to be renegotiated. And I think that the ideals expressed in that are not bad ideals at all.
Right.
Space should not be weaponized. The moon should not be owned. Its resources. It doesn't say the resources shouldn't be extracted. It says the resources should be for the good of everyone.
Right.
Whether they're on the moon or not, whether they're, contributing to space exploration or not, it's our common heritage.
And mostly all things start with great intentions. And I feel like that's a great intentions document. But as we know from the history of human civilization, is often we take the good intentions.
Good intention starts.
And then a few negatives filter in, and, we know history and we've repeated it a few times. But my question is for Noreen. You are a Greek myth expert. Or you've been studying Greek myths for quite some time.
Yeah.
So how does that connect us with outer space? And what are some of the lessons within the Greek myths that we can learn?
Yeah, I think when I look at them, and again, I certainly wouldn't be an expert on all the Greek knowledge about the skies and how they interpreted the stars and things. But when I do look at their stories, I do feel there is a similarity, especially with the early ones, before they get obsessed with codifying knowledge, which does happen, that there's similarities with Indigenous stories.
Right.
And that they're very, very connected with the movements of the stars and the planets. Planet, the word comes from, it means wander. And it's because they noticed that there were fixed stars and stars that wandered. So the planets are the planetes asteres, the wandering stars. And they didn't have, although we call the planets by the Roman names for the gods, the Greeks didn't call them by the Greek names for the gods. They associated them with different gods, but they were looking at their characteristics. So because they could see a red glow from Mars, that was the fiery one. So they were looking at the characteristics. They were very attuned because they were agricultural and seafaring, right? They were very attuned to the seasons and the movements of the stars. There's beautiful poetry. It doesn't all remain from the 7th century BCE about a festival and a chorus of dancers who are reproducing the movements of the stars as the Hyades and Pleiades change places in the sky, because that's a particularly important agricultural time in the autumn. So when I think of Hilding's story about Moon and the 7 birds, this resonates for me with what the ancient Greeks are saying. But it does change over time. And by the time we get to the Roman Empire, knowledge is being codified, and we get Ptolemy's work, which is all about measuring distances and the stars from the immovable Earth in the middle of the sky. It's somehow in the 2nd century CE, a number of works codify knowledge. This happens in medicine and in astronomy. Get translated into Arabic and Latin, and then that's the gospel for another 1,000.
Truth for however, yeah.
Absolutely, which is really interesting, but it doesn't. On the Greek side, it doesn't reflect that very early, deep connection between daily life and the stars.
Right.
You know, it's taken it to a different, more mathematical sort of end, and lost a little bit, I think, of the magic of the stories.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar. A lot of people know about the Elgin marbles, the marbles that were stolen from Greece from a 5th century BCE temple, the Parthenon. And on there is a beautiful imagery of the sun and the moon. And they envisaged them also as being pulled along the sky by chariots.
Right.
All right. So Selene was the goddess of the moon, Helios, the god of the sun, and they drove these chariots. And so you've got the sun rising on the eastern part of this pediment with his horses, and Selene going down on the western part. So the imagination again, right? When you see how they were trying to understand what was going on up in the sky, is wonderful. It's fascinating. I don't know enough about it, but those are some of the
magical
interesting stories.
It's because we didn't know anything at that time. The humankind, and we decided to make up stories to give them value. And I think that's a lot of the themes in your book that I took away from that. And it's very beautiful, and it takes you back to those stories that you were told, or that gave meaning to us when we were growing up, even as kids.
Jim, so in our seasons, we've talked to entrepreneurs. We know that the Alberta space sector is chomping at the bit, let's say, to use an Alberta euphemism here, to get going and put ourselves on the international stage, kind of prove itself, hitch both our horses to this wagon here, sticking to our Alberta metaphors. and what does that look like to put this art, put this humanity, put this spirituality, so we don't lose it in Alberta? Put you on the spot here.
Yeah. No, I think when we talk about these conversations about we want to do this or we want to do that for this reason or for that reason, I think it's important that the conversation include as many people as possible as early as possible. Okay. Because what you don't want is to dream up this project and then at the very end call in the ethicist. And the ethicist says, well, you really should have talked to Indigenous elders, or you really should have thought about the effect on the biosphere, or you really should have thought about that. And if you bring in the ethicist at the end, it becomes phenomenally expensive because you have to go right back to the drawing board. Yeah. So I would say start the conversation early. To bring people into the conversation that you might not think would have a stake in it is actually, in the long run, I think, might be the pathway to success. Okay.
So, talking about, Indigenous stories and things like that, I've been recently looking at colonialism and in Canada and how that worked out. And when we came here, we didn't see fields, we didn't see fences, and we assumed that there was no agriculture, there was no organization, when in fact, a lot of, Indigenous populations worked in harmony with nature. So their fields look overgrown and unkempt to us, when in fact the plants were working in harmony together to provide food in a sustainable manner. And we just weren't able to see it because our viewpoint was European stone fences. We had this viewpoint. Noreen, maybe I ask you this, from hearing stories through the centuries, how do we make sure we're looking at problems through different lenses? Is there a way to practice this skill? Is there a way to infuse this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I guess the answer is practice it, right? But I think one of the things is, how do we get decision makers to practice it, right? I think we've practiced it or tried to show, some of these different viewpoints and things in the book. And we've learned a lot from it by just talking to all our contributors and seeing their viewpoints, and particularly Hilding. I think his essay is extraordinary and really clear about, the what happens when you leave Indigenous voices out, and how we're in danger of just continuing colonization of outer space. And we're doing the same thing to Indigenous peoples and their beliefs and their culture all the time. They're not at the table. And he reports, I mean, all these big telescopes that are being developed, they're still, despite protests, despite written protests, people actually, elders sitting on mountains, they're still not bringing Indigenous voices to the table. And I think the answer is you have to bring all these voices to the table. Somebody has to start doing this. I don't know how we convince, our governments or whatever to do that. I think Canada is doing a little better than some other places with the Truth and Reconciliation process, but we don't want it to be just paying lip service to it.
We don't want to celebrate. We're one step ahead. That's not a celebration yet. We got to keep going.
It's not, but it's a step in the right direction, but we're not there. And yeah, if you have any good ideas about how to make sure we bring these voices to the table, I mean, I think that's the place where we're at now.
It's people like yourselves, right? It's people like authors, poets, teachers, people who have a voice that can hopefully mold the minds of the next generation to be able to see those things in a critical way. Because who knows when that time will happen? It could happen pretty quickly. It could happen in 10 years, 50 years. It could happen next week, but doubtful. But yeah, those are the people that we need to be supporting. And we've always said it, but it's putting it into practice.
And, as both Hilding in his essay, but also Alice Gorman in her essay in her book, show that space exploration has unfortunately often been at the cost of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous lands. I mean, she's Australian. She talks about the development of the Woomera rocket range world. Australia was pretty big, as you probably know, in the early space race. And it was exactly what you talked about. They looked at this interior space and they saw nothing. And they thought, this is a great place to test rockets because there's nothing and nobody here. But they weren't seeing it the way the Indigenous peoples of Australia saw it, as a landscape with cultural significance, but also they were reading it in a particular way as well. So they thought there was no water there. The Indigenous people knew where the water was. The Australian scientists had to build a gigantic pipeline to get the water in. So there's costs to Indigenous folks for not bringing the perspective in, but there's also costs for the rest of us because they've got knowledge that we often need.
I think it's poetic that Robert Thirst did the afterword in your book. He's the first guest of ours on this season, so he actually bookends this our season 2 here.
Literally,
yeah, literally. And he's been to space, and oftentimes they have trouble describing what space is like, because I think we've all had those things in our lives where you don't really know it until you've experienced it. You maybe read all about it, but you don't know about it. Having these authors and poets, using in their mind, imagining what spaces would be like, and then having someone who's been to space and knows the answers. What was that experience like?
I have to say, I read over his afterword just this morning, and I was so charmed by it. I mean, and one of the things he talks about is how important it is to bring humanists to the table. Right. And he's got this funny little bit where he says, I wouldn't want advice from an English prof on docking a spaceship. However, we do need to have these perspectives represented. And he talks in really warm ways, too, about the 1979 Space Treaty. And he said the ideals are great. And it's not just the common humanity, it's the care for outer space. Right. It's the keeping it peaceful, all those other sorts of things. So he's very much online, I think, and appreciative of a humanities approach, in fact. Right. And that, I thought, was really interesting for a guy who's trained as a scientist and an engineer and a doctor as well, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So somebody who's actually been there values a humanist perspective and says it's absolutely necessary. So I think, well, right on.
I wants more perspectives than just the economic one taken into account. He is a scientist and an explorer, I guess, at heart. But even so, he's, quietly critical of Musk and that approach. And he's really foregrounding collaboration, right? Really, over and over, he keeps saying we have to... outer spaces for everyone. Everyone has to have a voice in what's going on. And that is, yeah, I'm not sure what we expected when we asked him to write the afterword, but that was exactly what we hoped.
Perfect.
would come out.
It's always good when that works out.
Such a great,
he's delighted.
And he's such a great
so nice.
speaker, and he talks to children at schools a lot. And throughout this amazing podcast that we've been able to run for the last 2 seasons, and you're our final guest, by the way.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We've spoken with people about their jobs in the space industry, but also what it means to them and like where they started, where their spark happened. And even speaking with a space medicine person who was it was Michael Gallagher,
Yep.
who was the former president of the Space Flight Professionals.
Yep.
And so he's a working doctor in rural Alberta. And he talks about our relationship with death. And he made me critically think about what it would be like to lose somebody who was in space and they were never going to come back. But they do mock death exercises with families of people who go to space. And I thought that was so unique and so interesting. So the amount of information we've received that we were able to think critically about, and hopefully whoever's watching is also thinking critically about. So I feel like we're part of that as well. Like, podcasting is definitely an art in its own way. And we get to tell stories of so many impressive individuals such as yourselves on the podcast.
I have a story myself. So I used to go into classrooms and talk to kids. And this girl came up, I think she was 9 or 10, and asked me, what happens when you die in space? Try to go, well, again, there's the technical stuff of this is what happens, what to do is there's, like you said, even, dealing with family and stuff like that. And she was not impressed with my answer at all. I said, no, what do you do with people who die in space? And I was fundamentally confused until a teacher told me that her father ran a funeral home, and she was asking specifically, what do you do step by step? Because that was her viewpoint and her understanding of death. And it blew me because I'd never considered even thinking about that. I mean, I don't know. So, there are experts everywhere, and people's viewpoints, come from all over. And just because you don't understand does not invalidate them. Just means you don't understand.
Yeah.
And I did not understand.
And curiosity is super important.
Yeah.
So ask the question.
Absolutely.
Yes, exactly. And empathy, which is
100%.
what the humanities are all about. Trying to understand and respect somebody else's perspective, while not necessarily agreeing with it,
Right.
but trying to understand them where they are.
So you're both professors at U of C, and this is your first foray into the space world. How has it differed from, your other projects that you've done, the other books you've written?
Well, for me, I suppose it's not the Jim has done other projects like this through the CIH, where you're drawing together all sorts of different viewpoints on particular themes. It's the first time really that I've done it, and I'm just overwhelmed with joy about the project. I loved it so much, and I think that Jim will add this, so I'll just say it. I suppose from the start, an award-winning book on my special field, but this is more precious to me. I think this is more useful. This is I'm much more proud of this. I'm so thankful to have been able to be part of producing this book that talks more broadly and about really, really important things to everybody, not just to my little group of fellow scholars. So, it's been a really amazing experience for me. Yeah.
Wonderful. Jim, just as amazing, or was it just a terrible, awful experience?
Sorry,
No, I can't really top that. No, it was. I love, again, I work like Noreen, and my main stuff is pretty narrow. I work on late 16th century English poetry. And so to be able to talk in really productive ways with an archaeologist and an astronomer, and to bring an artist and a poet into the conversation, it's just so freeing in a lot of ways.
Right.
Freeing and also thrilling to be part of a whole kind of chorus of voices. And it's a challenge to give up being an expert. And this is probably something that you experience here, to allow yourself to not really understand, but to be thrilled by the experience of learning it.
Right.
So to hear about electrostatically charged dust on the moon, which becomes fairy castles, or 3 billion-year-old shadows, and how a moon shadow is different than an Earth shadow and why is kind of an astonishing bit of knowledge that I can't do anything with, really.
But you have it now.
Yeah.
You own it.
Now.
Yeah, it's yours.
And it's a wonderful thing, really. It's a precious thing. And frankly, to see other people's enthusiasms, and you people guys as well, but other people's enthusiasms are wonderful to encounter.
I think we talk about passion a lot, and how, I mean, that drives space, I think, because it is very, very hard. But when you meet a passionate person anywhere, it's hard not for it to be infectious.
Mm-hmm.
We need to make sure we're, using that and pushing it towards noble goals, and because you can be passionate about anything.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what's next for both of you? What are you working on right now besides your day-to-day?
Well, for the Institute, we're actually co-editing a very different book on energy justice, energy sovereignty, which is a multidisciplinary approach, again, to the question of resource extraction here in Alberta. And we have 5 people from 5 different disciplines, plus an artist. And then we've decided we're going to ask an engineer to reflect on all of it.
Okay, that is a tall order. You have to get the engineer to reflect.
Zach's a bit,
Yeah, I am. That's
But again, we want to keep opening up conversations and to see what an engineer thinks about what humanists are saying about energy.
right.
And to expose them to that, and to expose us to his particular point of view.
Flip the script there a little bit to say that. I think that would be. I am actually, as an engineer that works in the energy sector, that's a very interesting prospective, and let's see how that goes. Because I know some folks that might be excited to do that. I know some folks that would be, let's say, opposed to doing that. So
Energy security, energy sovereignty, energy justice. That's the title of the book. Should it all happen?
We want this conversation to expand. We don't want it to get lost in little silos, so I think that's important.
Yeah. And I mean, this is the thing generally here in Alberta that we forget, is that we all have a stake in energy. We all need to relearn how to talk to each other across our boundaries. We have a common interest.
right. Yeah.
And a lot of times I think we have forgotten how to talk to each other, how to listen to each other, how to understand another person's stake in this. And then maybe, we can be a little less heated and a little bit more judicious in where we go with these conversations, with these decisions.
We can be so quick to judge when somebody's talking about their job, like, oh, I work in oil and gas. Oh, you work in oil and gas, do you? Oh, I see.
Yeah.
You don't love the earth. But
And the opposite. And, and we dig ourselves in, and it does nobody any good.
Right.
Now I'm curious. This wasn't a question, but I really want to ask it. How did you guys meet? How was it? Was it in university that you hooked up and decided to do this project together, or how did that come about?
It's a little bit more mundane in a way.
Were you forced together? Was it just a faculty assignment? That,
No. I happen to be the associate director of the Institute, and Jim's the director. So we've worked together for a number of years.
Okay.
And it just, I think this is the first book that the CAH has done since I've been associate director, because you did some earlier ones on water and plants and animals, a wonderful series. Again, you can check it out online, Calgary Press. And they were from previous seminars, but it just, not always does a community seminar lend itself to a book, or where, you just can't see quite how it would all come together. So I think, we just happened to be working together at the Institute, and this one seemed to, look like a good bet, and here we are.
And I think too, Noreen has attention to detail, whereas I don't. And so it made the editorial practice much, much better.
Okay.
To have her eye. Yeah. I've got good contacts in the art world. She's got good contacts in other worlds.
Okay.
And so it was a really great process, actually.
Well, I think that worked out to make a beautiful book. I mean, not only is it, I think, the stories in there are impactful, but it's just put together in a beautiful way. It's just a pleasure to hold and to read, honestly.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That's so good to hear.
And you have such great chemistry together. So I can imagine that it plays well into the books and the future books that you're doing.
Right.
Should we do our book club?
Yes, so we're at the part of our episode where we do our book club. We're going to don our book club
Yours is
hats.
a-
My hats. Oh.
Special hats.
I did too. Our book club
I
hats.
got dual hats. So I have
Good.
both
Nice.
hats on.
Now,
Good luck.
you came to us with a book, and I think using your own book is cheating a little bit.
Right.
We ask guests to bring a book so that we can get to know them a little bit more. Our audience could read that to kind of, figure out who they are or what their passions are.
Right.
Do you have a book that you would recommend to our audience to pick up?
Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Although I brought a whole ton of books, I think we should concentrate on this one.
Let's do it.
Right.
You read this. Did you read this before you asked Alice to come?
I did, actually. When we started talking about this topic, I stumbled across this book by Alice Gorman, Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe. And it was just a stunning read. And so I thought, okay, if we can get her, then we're going to do the space seminar. And so in some ways, she's the core of it all. So the book, she is a space archaeologist, and so, which is an odd career path. And so she talks about how she got there, but she also mixes it in with what it means to grow up on a sheep farm in the middle of Australia,
Right.
looking up at the stars and so on. So it's a very interesting mix of a whole series of really great questions about the history of space travel, about ethical challenges of space, especially about space junk, which is her particular specialty, all of the stuff out there
Floating around forever.
floating around forever. But it's just a really, really great read, I would say, from MIT Press.
Okay.
So pretty legit as far as books go.
A space archaeologist. I'm super curious to know the definition of that job.
Yeah.
Well, she started out as actually an Indigenous heritage expert. So she'd be the person that they would call in to say, "Can we blow up this
Right.
mountain?" And she would say, "Well, no, there are rock carvings there." But at a certain point, she got intrigued with the whole idea of space heritage. So she looks at the cultural heritage of space travel here on Earth. So, for example, the Peenemünde missile development in Germany, the Woomera rocket site, and looking at what and how we should preserve of the artifacts here on Earth. But she also thinks about artifacts on the moon and how we should preserve them, what kind of rules we should put in place.
Because those are culturally significant.
Extremely
moon
culturally
landing
significant.
sites.
And she's also recently moved into thinking, and this is kind of an environmental thing, but thinking about the moon itself as an artifact. And there, you may know this, that there's a kind of international movement to grant the moon legal personhood. The way that certain rivers and glaciers and mountains here on Earth in various jurisdictions have been granted legal personhood, recognizing that they have a history and that they have a right to exist.
Right.
And what does that mean when they're recognized like that?
Then you can put certain protections around them and say, you can't do X or Y. So there's a river in New Zealand. There's actually a river in BC that people have talked about trying to grant cultural heritage to. There's a glacier in India. So various sites that we've said are so culturally significant that they need to be legally protected. And the moon may well be one of those.
Right.
And there may be good reason to give it legal personhood.
Fascinating.
So she's part of that. Great book.
That sounds like a very deep read there. There's a lot packed into that.
Yeah, but I'll give, listeners another reason to read it, because I read it at a different stage in the process. So after we'd had the seminar, we were putting things together, and I was going to write a piece for the book. And I read this. Jim kept saying it's really good. And for me, one of the things I study is life writing. And this is an autobiography as well as a book about space. And it's very beautifully done. And one of the things that really struck me, I'm a bit older than she is, but she's relating something that happened to her that happened to lots of women, or even when they were girls in school. She was discouraged from going into science.
Right.
Even though she was doing as well as the boys in her class. And eventually she didn't go into science. She came to it much later, went back into it later. And I think the way she tells the story in here is really powerful and beautiful too. So it's just another angle on this book. There's so much in it, and it's very clearly and beautifully written. It is there's a lot in it and it's deep, but it's very accessible. And I think there's lots of reasons for picking it up. Indeed.
Well, we must pick it up then.
I'll have to read it.
And there's a meteorite named after her. So
Yeah.
There you go.
Amazing.
I'll shoot that from next life goal. I guess I need some space thing named after me.
Exactly.
We'll have to work on that. Season 3. We'll work on that for season 3. Fantastic. Well, Jim, Noreen, thank you so much for coming out here and talking to us here for season 2 of Albertans in Space. I think we learned a lot. I think it was a journey that you took us on kind of through the history and reiterating how important art and spirituality and, let's say, the humanities are to humans. So thank you very much for doing that.
Well, thank you so much for having us. It's been a real great opportunity, and we're always happy to talk about this project.
Fantastic.
I think it's really important to have that critical element, to understand how to approach things ethically. All those things are combined in science fiction films and books and having conversations with really well-educated people on the subject. So thank you so much for coming. We totally had an amazing time. And thanks for closing out the season with us as well.
You.
And we're looking forward to reading your next book.
Great.
Super.
Thank you.
We would like to thank Dr. Jim Ellis and Dr. Noreen Humble for joining us today and allowing us a platform to speak critically about human nature and how to interact with space ethically.
To quote the great Bob Thirsk from the afterword of this book, the hard part of future exploration will be managing the spectrum of partners and the diversity of interests so that we can explore safely, sustainably, equitably, and peacefully. It won't be easy, it will be hard. It will measure the best of our energies and skills, and we will succeed because the exploration of the final frontier is too important to get wrong. If you're interested in reading the text for yourself, please go to the University of Calgary website to order yourself a copy.
Shout out to Sandra Lynn for her writing and research efforts, Matt Waterworth, our sound video engineer at NoCap Content Studios, his assistant Parth Kelkar, 6 Degrees Music and Sound, and Kristen, our behind-the-scenes photographer, for helping us make this podcast sound and look amazing. We'll see you next season on Albertans in Space. Thanks for watching and listening. Big thanks to all our guests this season: Bob Thirsk, Jennifer House, Chris Hurd, Brian Hill, Priya Manavalan, Kaylee Beer, Regan Hinchcliffe, Madison Feehan, and Jim Ellis and Noreen Humble.
Thank you so much for watching Albertans in Space. We hope you enjoyed the second season. Make sure to tune into our socials to watch behind the scenes and exclusive content. You can watch Albertans in Space on TELUS Optic TV, Stream Plus, and our YouTube channel. For those who prefer listening, catch us on Spotify. If you like the show, don't forget to hit subscribe and give us a like. Your support means the world to us.
Lastly, stay connected. Follow and say hi to us on Instagram at AlbertansInSpace_podcast and on TikTok at AlbertansInSpace.
Well, we'll see you guys next year.
I can't wait.
Roll credits.
Let's wrap it up.
Let's do it.